I work in market research. I'm here representing a market research company, but I began my professional life in publishing. So it's a real treat for me. I feel like I'm back among friends and back among the books, quite importantly. But I feel that maybe I shouldn't start today by thanking you at all. And maybe I should start with an apology, because I came to Madrid from London, but I flew in. And there was a part of me that felt a little bit guilty about it. I was reading this morning, in Sweden, they've actually got a word for it. I think it's flicksdam, or flicksjam, and it translates to flying shame. And it's little wonder with the people that you see on the screen. And you see the slogans on the placards behind me. Youth choose climate justice. I think this year particularly there's been a snowball effect since Greta Thunberg made her protest in Sweden, and it's becoming a bit of an assumption or a preconceived notion, shall we say, about young people that they're very politically engaged, they're very activist, and very concerned about the environment. But I wonder how representative this picture really is, if this is telling the whole story. There's a lot of second-hand talk and speculation about what young people or Generation Z may think and what they may believe, but little in the way of facts and figures to bolster it. But that's what we try and provide at Global Web Index. If you've not heard of us before, we're a market research company that runs the world's largest multi-country syndicated dataset. We interview 550,000 internet users across 45 markets, although I should say that for today, I'll be focusing mostly on the 17 markets that we track in Europe. And just as another admin point for today, we define Generation Z as internet users aged between 16 and 22. And we do our research to build out a rounded picture of online lives and the digital landscape in general. Our clients are typically big brands and agencies. We count Google, Havas, and Publicis among our clients. And they've been pretty interested in Generation Z recently as well. There was a point recently where there were 4, or maybe even 5, analysts in my team all working on big projects with Generation Z as their focus. And it's little wonder, Bloomberg predicts that they're poised to outnumber millennials as of this year, and the National Retail Foundation puts a figure of $44 billion on their overall spending. And I imagine this is going to increase as they come into more spending autonomy in the next few years. So I mentioned about that climate activism just now, and I think, again, because they're often not old enough to write in their own voice, there's a lot of assumptions, stereotypes, preconceived notions, whatever you want to call them, about this group. But there's not much yet in the way of research to really bolster this out. And so I want to go a few of these assumptions, shall we say, today. And I want to do it really to drive 3 purposes that I think will be relevant to everyone in the room. First is understanding who they're like as consumers. That's very much our bread and butter, so what sort of products they're interested in, how they might research products, what their attitudes are like towards advertising. But then we can also look at how they stand in the marketplace of attention. And this is all about what devices they're interested in, how long they're spending on them, how they might consume different media. And then thirdly, I think we can also look at how they stand in the marketplace of ideas. What sort of topics are they particularly interested in? And maybe what stories would they like to be told? So this is the first one to look at, this sense of possible activism. I think it's quite an exciting time. You could make the case that maybe Greta Thunberg is the first mainstream celebrity from this generation. And we do find that this group do have a decent amount of concern for the environment. In market research, we're normally concerned with what people agree with when we present them with certain statements. But we find Gen Z are quite likely to disagree with the statement, I feel there's a positive future for the environment. So they're quite pessimistic as far as this side of things is concerned. And we did a one-off survey into the UK and US as leading markets to really do a deep dive into attitudes to the environment. And you can see here there's this very interesting generation trend on responsibility, or where responsibility is identified for upholding the environment. And you see older generations tend to be more individualistic, shall we say, whereas Generation Z and millennials as well think it's more of the government's responsibility, that it's the government's role to step in. But how this concern for the environment actually translates into the marketplace can be a little bit hard to define. I'm sure you'll appreciate there's often a difference between what someone says they're going to do and then what they will actually do for themselves. So on one hand, they say they're more likely to pay more for sustainable products, sustainability obviously being a big conversation at the moment. But on the other hand, it seems like they're less likely to want brands to produce eco-friendly products. So what's going on here? Well, the data on this particular slide warrants a bit of explanation, because this comes from one of the more interesting questions in our core survey. And this comes from when we ask consumers, what do you most want your favorite brands or companies to do or to provide for you? And we limit answers to a maximum of 3 responses. And what that does is it gives us a really good sense of a consumer's particular priorities at a certain point in time. So you see, for Generation Z, they are quite keen on the eco-friendliness and being responsible in production. It's still, I think, their second or third biggest wish overall. But there's other things that are in competition a bit more. I think fundamentally, this is still a group of young people, and so image is still very important to them. And this environmentalism, this activism, maybe it can't be disentangled from the sense of image. And this extends beyond the environment as well. As you may expect, this is a very cosmopolitan generation. They're very motivated by equality and diversity. They see it as almost a standard and think it's something that should be actively strived for. We see a bit more comfort with sexual fluidity as well. But you see, again, peer opinions are always playing a role. I don't want to give the impression that they only believe, what the last person who told them said, or that their views are in any way artificial. But again, at the moment, this is a group that's comprised largely of teenagers and people just out of their teen years. And I think it means that group consensus is always going to be very important in how their opinions are formed. And this has relevance, I guess, to some people in the room as well, because it informs how they keep track of what's going on in the world and how they respond to news. And it's actually quite a complicated picture, because on the one hand, they seem very interested in news and current affairs. They're more likely than their older counterparts to use social media to keep track of news. They spend quite a lot of time reading the press each day, and that's both online and offline. But on the other hand, we tend to find they have less of a self-declared interest in news and current affairs, and they're less likely to use news apps. I think part of the reason for this is because they don't tend to see news as a separate category. I think for them it's often part of an ongoing flow of information, usually accessed through social media, and so for them news is often found in that place, and it's often done in a mediated way. It might come through friends' posts or reposts or retweets, something like that. So in a summary for this section, maybe environmentalism and identity are quite bound together, and with news, it's kind of tied up interactively with social media. And on the subject of social media, I don't think it's really under any doubt that this group are quite heavy users of it, but I find probably the more interesting and most relevant debate is what sort of role Facebook has. Now, I'm a millennial, and for people in my generation, often coming to social media, it was done through Facebook. That was the first platform to really go mass market, and it's still the most visited platform for millennials, Generation X, and baby boomers. With Gen Z, the picture is a little different. We find that 2/3 are going on there, so it's not a dead platform by any means, although we are seeing year-on-year decline, so this is something to keep an eye on. But the most popular social network for them is Instagram. And I think Instagram is really key to understanding much of their online life and who they are as people as well. I've got some data that shows that quite nicely. There's a fair bit of figures on the screen, so let me give you a quick walkthrough of it. So what we're looking at is users of each social network in Generation Z. So this is Instagram users, WhatsApp users, Snapchat users, and so on. And then the figures are how often they check that platform on a given day, or on average, I should say. So with Facebook, you see it's not necessarily the go-to platform of choice. It's more about regular visits, probably to watch a video or read a news article. What I find really amazing here is that Instagram is visited more in the day than WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger because they're messaging apps. They're designed for instant communication. You get a message on there, you can go in and reply straight away. And Instagram has a private messaging function, but that's not really what it's built for. And with that in mind, I find it amazing that it's still checked more in the day than the other platforms. And I think it really goes to show, really underlines just how central it is to this generation, and maybe to their identity and to their behaviors as well. And it's got other implications across our data set, I think, this fingerprint of Instagram. So what we're looking at here is self-declared interests where Generation Z are most ahead of millennials and where millennials are most ahead of Gen Z. Now, obviously, a lot of this is tied up with life stage. If we did this study 20 years ago, I'm very confident that people in their mid to late 20s and early 30s would be more interested in DIY, gardening, and those sort of domestic things. And probably that young people are more interested in music. What I'm really interested in is that you see these spikes of interest for urban art and fine art and photography. These are all very visual things, they're very visual media, and I think it reflects that they have such a heavy use of a visual platform like Instagram and Snapchat to an extent as well. But probably the most important thing to note about their use of social media is that for them, it's not actually that social. We see a lot of activity for uploading photos and videos and stories to Instagram, but as far as self-declared intent goes, they see social media more as a source for content. I appreciate the difference doesn't seem that big on screen, but it's quite a profound difference because it makes them unique compared to any other generation. And there's another quite profound difference in how they use social media as well, which is that they're more likely than any other generation to research products on social compared to search engines. And that's quite an interesting shift because, of course, search engines are built to access knowledge and search around different resources. So I find it quite interesting that for them, their go-to for finding out information, particularly when buying things, they do it in this other world. Now, you may have noticed a couple of slides ago, there was such a big discrepancy between Gen Z and millennials for interest in television. And of course, with social media being this content go-to, I think it puts this extra pressure on TV. And we're, I think, quite familiar with some of the cliches about this generation, that they don't know a life before the internet, they're very used to freedom of choice. And I think one of the questions that comes out of that is, well, what sort of relevance does TV have? It has ad breaks that are interruptive, its schedules are maybe a bit rigid. I think the popular logic is that it's incompatible, shall we say, with how this generation operates. We find that traditional or broadcast or linear TV is still fairly important, although the gap between it and its online equivalent is narrower than for any other generation. Really, the key for them with television is that it's device flexibility. So it's just another form of entertainment that they can follow around from device to device. So they're much more likely to watch it on PC, mobile, games consoles, and so on. It's not just a glass box with wires coming out of it. But the total amount of TV they spend overall is quite a bit reduced to other generations. And I think this is probably because of that competition from social media and video platforms. I've got some data here that shows that in a quite elegant way. So what we're looking at here is, on a base of YouTube users, for each generation, which sort of clip they're more likely to watch, whether it's a celebrity vlog clip or a clip from a TV show. And with older generations, you see that it's TV show clips that come out on top. I think what this shows is that for them, YouTube, in effect, it reinforces an existing media ecosystem. They're often going there to watch content in a sense that they watch elsewhere or they already know. And that's still relevant for the younger generations, but these spikes for celebrities and vloggers, I think, shows how, for them, YouTube, social media, and the video on it is a separate place, and it's got its own presence, its own personalities, and one that rivals TV for cultural influence. I think the other side of this supposed incompatibility with television is a potential rejection of advertising in all its forms, I think, again, if we understand this generation to be very technologically literate, to be so used to digital media, it seems like they'd just be so fluent with ad blockers and maybe so equipped to filter out irrelevant information that they wouldn't tolerate advertising at all. And we do find that they're more likely to use digital ad blocking tools. They do have that tech savviness. But at the same time, as we saw before, this is still a group of young people. It's still where image is important. And that's something that advertising can tap into. But it does mean that they are probably less tolerant of irrelevant messaging. And so there's quite a bit of quality control in their minds. Of course, this is a generation used to looking at a lot of online media, a lot of information per day, and they're probably better equipped to filter it out anyway. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're resistant to messaging from brands or companies in any sense. I think even if these push messages from advertising may be harder to reach them or harder to land with them, there's still a significant pull factor that can work. We saw a few slides ago that they view social media as an entertainment platform, a content platform, and branded messaging can still fall under that category. And as well as the data you see on screen, I think it's around a third who visit branded pages on Instagram. So even in these social spaces, which you might think of as being more intimate and maybe closed off from that particular world, they're quite keen to engage with businesses. And this sense of constantly being on social media, I think naturally brings on a scrutiny on their overall screen time. I think it's an accusation commonly put at their feet, that they're always on their screens, that they're addicted to their screens, that they can't log off. But it kind of depends on what you define as a screen. Because if you include television, then their amount of average, should we say, screen time per day is actually a little bit down from millennials. It's a lot higher than for Gen X or for baby boomers, and there's certainly a lot more time spent on mobile, but it's a little bit down from the millennial peak. And screen time isn't necessarily the kind of thing you can take for granted. One of the more interesting bespoke studies we did across US and UK as leading markets was on digital detoxing and finding out what sort of attitudes people had towards logging off and moderating their time spent online. I think we often think of it in a very acquisitive or additive sense that there's only ever more and more of it. But we found a good number of Gen Z, 80% in fact, had done something to moderate their time spent online. Now this includes quite a few techniques or things they could do if you like. So this might be deleting an app, deactivating a social media account, even just putting a device into another room for a prolonged period of time. So it includes quite a number of short-term and more long-term things to do, shall we say. But if we understand this generation to be all those things that are said about them, that they don't know a life before the internet, don't know a life before social media, and are very technologically literate, I think maybe one of the things that's less well understood about that is that they may be aware themselves of the potential dangers of technology and that maybe they can self-educate in that respect. And so their own amount of screen time is something they put some scrutiny on. And of course, it's little wonder because we find that in our data, there's this almost equal and opposite reaction, if you like. So we tend to find that among internet users who are younger and spend a lot of time consuming media, which counts very much for Generation Z, there's this sense of friction that can come in at the same time. So half of them say that there's too much choice online, and that a quarter say technology makes life more complicated. And this actually, in both respects, this actually puts them slightly ahead of older internet users, which you may find quite surprising. But I think it goes to show that they don't just use their screens mindlessly, if you like. There's a certain conscientiousness that comes behind their browsing and their use of digital media overall. And I think there's always a subtext that's given with this accusation that they're always on the screens about what it means for books, what it means for the art of reading, and whether that kind of thing could die off in the future. What sort of competition is there for digital media? And we find, at least as far as self-declared personal interests go, books are still holding fairly steady. There's a bit of a dip from baby boomers, but it's not a massive one, and it's a little bit up from millennials. And it's true in our purchasing data as well. They're just as likely to have bought a book as any of their older counterparts. Now, obviously, you have to make some allowance here for educational material. Many of these people are still at school, still at university, and you can imagine they may be buying books in that category. But it still, I think, overall bodes well for an audience of prospective future readers. You notice as well they're very keen engagers with podcasts. I think this is one of those areas, a bit like we saw with Instagram and the interest in art, that there's places where digital media and maybe more legacy media can interact and aren't necessarily in strict competition for time. You notice again this pronounced drop-off in interest in TV, and I think that actually opens up potentially opportunities elsewhere. I talked about digital detoxing. I think one of the other things that's commonly said about this generation is that they may be more interested in moderation rather than rebellion. So I'm looking at a physical detoxing side of things here, if you like. And we do find that for this generation, maybe youth isn't defined as much by experimenting with certain substances and certain behaviors as it was in the past, if that was ever really true. So we define Gen Z as internet users aged between 16 and 22, but even if we bump up the minimum age so that includes people of legal drinking age across Europe, we do find that Gen Z are at this age-related trend of less interest in alcohol and consuming alcohol less. Veganism has never really been outside of the headlines this year, certainly in the UK, and we find that there's still a minority of Gen Z who are self-declared vegans, but they're really at the vanguard of experimenting with cutting out more meat for their diets. They may be more flexitarian and taking more of an interest in what they eat and maybe its provenance as well. But this interest in health, it goes beyond these quite defined categories of meat and alcohol, and it seems to be something that touches all parts of their life. So they're more likely to buy things like exfoliating products and sports clothing and health foods, all of which cut across categories but have a tinge of self-care associated with them. And on the flip side, they're probably less interested in soft drinks, frozen foods, that sort of thing. I think, again, it really shows a holistic approach to health among this generation, one that technology itself may be coming under when we saw the information related to screen time earlier. And it seems to go beyond what they pick up in the shops as well. We find that this is a very aspirational generation. I find it quite interesting that they have so much of a self-declared career bent than older counterparts, or maybe that's just the effect of not working for so many years. And there's an interesting little addition to this as well, that they have a really pronounced interest in entrepreneurship. I think that ties together a few threads of what I've mentioned today. They're very motivated by personal branding, perhaps, and that's something that social media, particularly Instagram, tends to exacerbate. So let's recap. Instagram is probably the key to unlock a lot of their behaviors online and how they work as people. I think a lot of what we've seen today is ripple effects of Instagram, if you like. I think with the slide you just saw about interest in health and self-care, that may be because of pressure from Instagram as a platform to appear in a certain way. They are tech-savvy and as tech-fluent as being born in the late 90s, early noughties is likely to make you to be, but they're still fairly conscientious. There seems to be an undercurrent of conscientiousness in this group for quite a few different things, and technology screen time may be falling under that purview. TV is still fairly popular, but it's not the cultural colossus it once was. For them, the media landscape is a bit more fragmented, and there's quite a long tail of online video, not just YouTube, but across other video platforms as well. But I suppose my overarching takeaway is there's one phrase I kept coming across when I was reading and researching about Generation Z in preparing for this, which is millennials on steroids. I'd say beware the tendency to view them as millennials on steroids. They are a distinct group. They've got their own particular preferences, their own particular habits. In many ways, in many areas, they're staking new territory for their own or reversing age-based trends. And one of the things I found when putting this together is a lot of what defines millennials isn't necessarily their age or even the technology that was around when they were coming of age, which is a common assumption that's made about it. A lot of what influences millennials is actually the effects of the crash in 2008. It comes from a different place, maybe a more socioeconomic one. And I think, just personally, I wonder if 2016 may be a similarly symbolic year for Generation Z. It's the year that saw so much disruption here in Europe, the election of Trump, the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement. I think even the fact that it seemed to be the year of so many celebrity deaths seemed to be quite symbolic of how they move on from the old guard of celebrity, and perhaps the people they look up to come from a slightly different place. I appreciate this has been a very whistle-stop tour, and I've fired quite a lot of data at you, but I'm more than happy for you to come up to me and ask me about anything you've seen here, and I can give you some more detail about it. But thanks very much for listening to me. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.